Hello guys, and welcome to your pencil shading and form practice. This video will cover how to generate your practice sheet. Unfortunately, with us being online, I don't have an easy way of getting you these kinds of worksheets, but luckily they're pretty easy to just make ourselves. So the first couple minutes here, we will look at how to actually make this, and then you can start with the exercise. If you watch, I just used my 6-inch ruler to make my boxes for a couple gradients. You can use any kind of rectangular object to kind of accomplish this. Obviously, just tracing the outside of a ruler is really easy, but you can consider using a pencil as a ruler, grabbing a piece of cardboard. Anything that has a nice straight edge that you can work with should do the trick. I ended up splitting my gradient into 6 boxes. I would recommend doing about the same, as you'll be able to kind of vary your tones nicely. Next, we have a box that does not have any separators in it because we're going to be doing a smooth gradient. Followed by that, we have a little bit of notes. These you'll be able to look at on the final sheet, which is posted on Schoology. But just to review, we are working with forms, which are going to be 3D shapes. There's a couple other things to think about, such as your light source, which is going to be where the light is coming from, as well as things like your cast shadow, which will be behind your object, and when you're actually shading your forms, which directions your lines will go to kind of help support the idea that they're round, even though it's going to be on a flat piece of paper. At this point, I start drawing my shapes. You can see that I added a light source, indicated by the little small lamps that are up in the corners. And we're going to be working with a few basic shapes. More or less, you have spheres, cones, and squares, or maybe rectangles. And we also will work with kind of a multi-faced diamond shape on this worksheet. But the same rules will apply for all of these when you get to shading. I also want to note that you do have a reference media album on Schoology for you to look at, to review when you come back to start to actually shade these. So make sure that you're checking that out and also following along with this video. Once you have your worksheet drawn out, feel free to get started on completing each of the tone by tone boxes and then working on the shading of the 4 shapes at the bottom. You can choose to wait until after our introduction class, but if you'd like to get a head start on it, feel free. So switching gears a little bit to what we're actually trying to accomplish here with this worksheet, we are going to be starting with pencil shading here for this week. What that means is that we will be shading 3D forms and eventually making a still life to kind of help solidify some of the information that we're going to be gaining here. First things first, to start, we do want to work with some gradient scales, and that's what we're doing right now. These are really beneficial in that it helps you learn how much pressure to put down on a pencil in order to make lines darker, make them lighter, how to get a consistent tone, and what the limitations of your pencil may be. Now in class we will talk about pencil hardness scales, how the different levels grade and what that means, but just know that in this video I work with a 2B pencil and a 6B pencil to get my lighter and darker tones. So our objective here is to fill all of our boxes with increasingly dark tones, and we accomplish that by using more pressure and pushing down harder with our pencil. I also will start to layer my graphite on top of itself more for the darker boxes because that's going to build up those dark tones. Now, a little bit ago I mentioned the different hardness levels of these pencils. This one that I'm using now is a 2B, which isn't getting as dark as maybe I want it to be for this scale. We can definitely get it a lot darker. So I end up switching to a 6B in order to layer and get those tones darker. And you can see that I just work my way around. And then I'm going to also go back and work on the lighter couple boxes. Next, we're going to work on our smooth gradient, which you'll see is a gradual change from dark to light. I'm going to work from right to left and push a lot on the right hand side and then gently lessen the amount of pressure that I'm using in order to create a long gradual scale. This is really just dependent on pressure control. You don't need to fill every section of the box, but you do want to go back and kind of fill in some of those little spots. Careful to not overlap with the graphite you already have down too much. Next, I'm going to go back and add more of the darker tone to the right hand side using circle motions with my pencil, which you just saw. And that's going to blend the darker into the lighter tones a little bit better and not create too much streakiness. Next, I'm going to work with a tortillon stump, which you guys got in your art kits. You can also use your finger or just a little piece of scrap paper in order to get this effect. But we're going to use these to kind of smooth and blend our tones. As I do this, I'm using a small circular scrubbing motion, really similar to how we blend our color pencils. And you can notice that it is just smushing the graphite around, and it also kind of gets onto the tip of the stump and carries some of that graphite along. And you can see that that really helps smooth out the gradient. These two boxes should end up looking fairly similar to each other with equal tones between the top boxes and the bottom ones. So now we're actually going to get into our shading of these forms, and there's a few things that you want to think about before you start to put down your graphite. The first is thinking about your light source. So we have little lights represented by the little lamps that are up in the corners, and that's going to be the brightest point of your picture. So the light point will be closest to the little lamp, and the darkest point will be the opposite side. And next, you really want to make sure that you are following the shape of the object with your shading. So a sphere is going to have rounded shading, a cone will also have rounded shades, and as you work through the square, the shading should be fairly straight to kind of match those parallel lines that it has. So with this sphere, you can see that I am using a round shading technique. I am going to try to follow the shape of that back circle part so that it looks spherical. I'm going to start by adding just kind of a mid-tone. You can always go back and erase some of your graphite away, so you don't need to worry about it being too dark. From there, using small circles, I am going to start to build up the darker tone and very lightly work on the lighter part closest to the light source. Here I try to blend using the tortillon stump. Again, remember, you could use a piece of paper if you wanted to. Generally the stump, especially when it already has graphite on its tip, will be very dark, and it might end up being that you end up with a blob that has too much of a mid-tone. So I ended up going and erasing out a lot of the tones to kind of bring back that light to dark tone that I was going for. And it also has an added bonus of making it look smooth. These are sketches, so they don't need to be perfect, but you do want to have a very visible transition from light to dark. Next, I'm going to start to add the cast shadow, which is the shadow that would be on the ground behind our object. Same as with our shading shape, you want your cast shadow to follow the shape of the object that you're drawing. So a shadow for a sphere should be rather circular. Another thing to note is that you don't want to outline your shadow with like a strong line. Shadows gently fade, they have fuzzy edges. You don't really need to add a harsh line in order to depict where that shadow is. Shadows will also be darker closer to the objects and then lighter further away. I kind of messed up here and I didn't record the shading of the other three shapes on the original page. That completed worksheet is posted on Schoology for you guys, but then I also decided to flip my paper over and shade these other shapes, just so that you know what you need to do and what your shading should look like for these. Now remember, with cones, you want your shape to be kind of spherical, right? Because it's round, so it's going to be shaded with circular lines, and then our cast shadow should be more of a triangle shape because the cone is obviously pointy at the top. And again, it'll be darker closer to the shape and lighter further away. Next, we have a rectangle. The face of the rectangle that is facing towards us won't really get all that much shading because the light source is right there. You may get a little bit of a shadow on the opposite corner, and that's what I depicted. But the easiest way to kind of know what you would have with that would be to put a cube in front of you with a light source and see what happens. Next, I shaded the sides. I decided to make the top of my box the darkest shade. In general, you'll have one light tone, one mid-tone, and one dark tone when shading cubes. And I also was sure to make my shadow a little bit more squared off in order to help facilitate that shape. And just like with the other two, it should be darkest, closest to the shape itself. And now finally, taking what we figured out from our cube, you can do pretty much any number of sides for a geometric shape and manage to make it look 3D. This is pretty clear that the lightest point is the one that is closest to the light source, and then I shaded them darker and darker as it got further away. I also used my eraser a little bit there to kind of lighten up my top two tones because the one was a little bit too close to the other one. Now, because the shape of this one is so pointy at the bottom, I decided to make it look like it was standing up on end. It's also shorter at the top with a longer pointed bottom, so I adjusted the shape of the shadow to kind of help support that. This one I did go in and blend with the stump, and I was sure to blend the edges using small circles, and then I actually went back and also erased a little bit just to further blend out those edges a little bit. And this one actually looks very convincing that it's a diamond shape sitting up on its end, so I'm pretty happy with that, and it just goes to show you know, how little you really need to do in order to make something look really, really 3D on paper. I hope that this video is helpful to you guys. We will start with pencil shading still lifes later this week. Make sure that you reference your pictures and get to it. Have fun.